It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. How are you doing today, David?
Very good, very good.
And I understand you have a bit of a trivia question for us today?
Yeah, I thought this would be fun. We're hearing a lot about whistleblowers this week, and I thought I'd throw this out as a trivia question. One of us three, you, me, or Ralph Nader, is personally responsible for the modern usage of the word whistleblower.
Oh,
you want to guess?
My choices are Steve Scrovan, David Feldman, or Ralph Nader.
Yeah, who do you think of the three of us?
Well, you know what? I coached University High School football, so I've had a whistle around my neck and blown it. But you know what? I'm going to go with David Feldman.
I'm pretty sure it's not me. Ralph, you want to venture a guess?
I guess you were referring to me in the 1971 historic conference on whistleblowers that we had in Washington, D.C. The idea is to give them an ethical dimension. Whistleblowers then were seen as snitches, tattletales, and they now have a really critical role to play in making large corporations and government, unions and other institutions, universities accountable. So it's not a trivial question, David.
No, it's not. And why did you pick the word whistleblower for our usage fans?
Because it goes back a long way. Obviously, it had a street police image and traffic control, but it also goes back a ways in novels where it was used to, in effect, expose wrongdoing.
The Whistleblower Protection Act helped make this impeachment possible, right?
Yeah, actually, there's a formal process now. You can ask for whistleblower status if you're a government employee, and you have certain procedural protections. There are other protections, too. A lot more to go to allow millions of people to take their conscience to work every day, especially in big institutions. But we've made a lot of progress.
Well, that's very good. And that's certainly a lot in the news today and in the upcoming weeks. And we're going to get into a little bit more of that next week. But on this program today, we're going to welcome Professor Ugo Mattei, who divides his time teaching law at the University in Turin in Italy and at the University of California, Hastings. He's also an activist who back in 2011 devised and led a campaign to keep Italy from privatizing its water supply. Kind of an important thing, water. He did this through a national referendum where 27 million people voted. And guess what? They won. So we're going to find out how he pulled that off and what lessons we can learn from that experience here in America. Also, we always find some time to scurry over to the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., and find out what our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, has got cooking on the corporate crime beat. And if we have some time at the end, we'll try to knock out a listener question or two. But first, let's kick things off with our first guest, who convinced millions of his countrymen to vote for his idea. David?
Professor Ugo Mattei is Distinguished Professor of International Comparative Law at University of California, Hastings, and at the University of Turin, Italy. He is a widely published scholar in economic and political aspects of law, and his work has been translated into many languages. He masterminded, as lawyer and an activist, the Italian campaign against the privatization of water, and that was successfully completed in June of 2011 with a national referendum endorsing Professor Mattei's plan to recognize water as a common. He has also co-authored a book with Professor Laura Nader called Plunder, When the Rule of Law is Illegal. His latest book is The Turning Point in Private Law, which comes out in paperback next month. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Ugo Mattei.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this show. Thanks a lot.
Welcome. Yes, Ugo. We've known each other for quite a few years. Before we get into the whole issue of what you did on the ground in Italy to mobilize the citizens of Italy on the drinking water issue, what is the turning point in private law, which is the title of your book coming out next month?
Well, The Turning Point in Private Law is a small book that has the ambition to popularize the knowledge of private law as an agency of change in current situation. In other words, because of the corruption of the representative system produced by the excessive growth of the corporations, basically, the top-down perspective of law, that is to say, waiting for government to intervene with some statute to deal with issues, has very slight potentials. I've been teaching law for now almost 30 years, and I practically never seen a legal reform that was not originated by those that were trying to make the market friendly to their own business. So banking law is made by banks, insurance law is made by insurance companies, and this is like preaching to the convert in this program. But the turning point in private law kind of talks about the difference of the private law system from this perspective. In other words, the everyday functioning of the legal system, contract, tort, property. Those categories have been used for the last 250 years in order to transform commons into capital. Were the main machinery of transformation of modernity. There was a big shift in the law. Polanyi talks about the great transformation. There has been also a big shift in the law beginning in the late 18th century with the introduction of all sorts of institutional settings that we are using also today, whose main purpose was the transformation of commons into capital.
Let's interject here, Ugo. The commons represents property we all own together. Corporations don't own it, individuals don't own it. It's best exemplified in our country with the public lands and the public airwaves and a lot of other things. David Bollier in Amherst, Mass. has documented, and I know you've worked with him. Why don't you be very clear to our listeners, because very few people know that the people own the greatest wealth of all, which is the commons, and also involves pension money, pension trusts, mutual funds, but they've lost control of it. Why don't you define that first?
Well, the commons is a difficult category to define, but the principle around the commons is the principle of access as opposed to exclusion. So the institutions of private property and also the institutions of government are institutions based on the concentration of power and on exclusion. The commons, which is everything else, the stuff that are not appropriated either privately or by the claim of the government, are actually based on the opposite principles. And the opposite principle being not exclusion and concentration of power, but inclusion, access, and diffusion of power. So it belongs to all of us, unmediated by government institutions and, of course, unmediated by private institutions. So this big share used to be what was everything was in common before the construction of modernity, of modern institutions of private property and state sovereignty. And over time, in the last 200 years, property and sovereignty have been cutting the common, eating it, privatizing it in the case of private institutions, of governmentalizing it in the case of government.
Give 5 or 6 examples to make it more concrete for people.
Well, water would be the first example of a common. It's a gift of God. It's something that arrives from the sky. But commons are all those resources that are necessary for the development of human beings. So nature in general, the Amazon forest would be another very good example. National park systems in the United States have been using the idea of federal land, but federal land, in fact, is a way to deal the commons, to keep the commons in trust for future generations. Airways, you mentioned it. I mean, everything, it's really not a merceological category. It's not like a kind of thing that can be described as an object. The commons is more of a relationship between people, masses, and those actual assets that are necessary for life and for full development of personality. So everything can be recognized as a common. Something can be both in private property and a common in the same time. For example, if you own a very important painting by, Picasso or a big artist, you don't have the full ownership of that, because part of that, the cultural legacy, the artistic part, doesn't belong to you. So you're not entitled, for example, to get it burned or buried with you when you die, because the utilities of arts are in the commons. It's something that belongs to everybody and doesn't belong even to the private owner. So the question is how to make those things that belong to everybody be actually, which are utilities that are produced by everything, be actually governed into the interest of everybody.
Let's move from Ugo Mattei, the professor, the prolific author, to the national organizer. You did something that people in Italy thought was impossible. How did you discover it? You were reading through some new legislation from Rome, and tell us about how you did this.
Yeah, well, it was much more of a necessity than a choice. We've been working since the early 2000s. I was working together with a number of comrades and colleagues to second guess the ideology of privatization. Privatization, beginning with the fall of the Berlin Wall throughout the 90s and the early part of the 21st century has been a dogma that could not be discussed or disputed. It was just better to privatize rather than keep it into the public system. And Italy, from that point of view, has been a front runner. Italy privatized in the early part of the 90s about 150 billion euros of assets belonging to the state, companies, insurance companies, banks. A very thriving public sector of Italy has been privatized with no mercy. And these privatizations could not be challenged for a long time. If you were against privatization in Italy in the 1990s, you were an outcast. It was just something that could not be said, could not be discussed in polite circles. So beginning in the early part of the year 2000, I started with others to work on this privatization to see what happened to these assets, but assets that are very famous, like motorcycles like Ducati, for example, which would be, kind of a very important distinguished sign of Italian technology, were just sold to the Germans. And many of those things happened. And so we started to study hard the consequences of that. And the consequences was really bad. Privatizations are actually ways to plunder resources from the public and translate them into the private system with very little guarantees. The law is excluded from that. The government can sell whatever they want to sell without courts having any possibility to second guess. The government behaves as an owner of public property, and therefore as an owner can sell it. And we were trying to work a reform, and the reform had to be introduced in the civil code. And the idea was that we had to transform the rules of the civil code, which is in Italy is the most important piece of legislation, in order to include some serious defense of the public and the commons goods. Okay, and that was made in 2007 and 2008 within a commission that was called Commissione Rodotà, that was established in the Italian government at the time, and we produced a very articulated statute that has been discussed throughout Europe and everywhere, separating the notion of the commons as a legal category from the notion of public property, and giving important guarantees to both these notions, okay, within the law. When we were doing that, with the long work, what happened was that on November 16 of 2009, the Italian government, at the time Berlusconi was in office, passed a very sweeping statute that obliged immediate privatization by December 2011 of all the property belonging to local municipalities. Okay, in Italy, that means Italy is organized with about 8,000 local municipalities, and about 70% of the assets belonging to the public or to the commons are actually in property of those little municipalities. Okay, things like transportation, things like pharmaceuticals, things like water, things like electricity, all have been run, kind of locally since the early part of the 20th century. The law actually made it obligatory to privatize all of that.
Ugo, let me interrupt. Don't you think a better word than privatization is corporatization?
Yeah, absolutely. You can definitely talk about corporatization. The point is, that privatization is a kind of word that is very well used, is known, we know what it means. And I'm not sure that in political conversation, introducing words that are more sophisticated and more, clearly better, because it reflects the conditions in a better way, is a good tactic, because people don't understand what we talk about. I mean, the level of general ignorance about these processes is huge.
Let's go back to your fight.
So basically what happened was that the government decided to privatize everything with a stroke of a pen. And in Italy, we have the possibility to arrange a referendum to actually abolish legislation. Okay, so in Italy we have this constitutional device, which is a referendum, a popular referendum that can be deployed under exceptional circumstances. Very, very difficult to organize. You need 500,000 signatures in order to set it in place, and then you need to have a turnout to the vote of 50% plus one of the population, which just really never happens. Okay, very, very unusual. It happens for abortion, it happens for divorce, it happens for the nuclear, it happens for the really important things. It doesn't happen for, every piece of legislation, because there is a big imbalance between representative democracy and direct democracy. So we decided to try to organize that referendum, and the way to do it was pretty simple. We just sat down, me and Rodotà and some others, and we wrote down what could be the question to ask the people in order to abolish the law. That is a very technical thing to be done. It's very difficult because you can only abolish in Italy, formally abolish a law. There are all sorts of restrictions of constitutional law of the kind of gerrymandering, if you want to use this term, of the legislation you can make in order to make it pass in the sense you want. So there, what we wanted to do was really to safeguard especially water. That was the first item in the list of the commons. And therefore, we introduced a package of 3 different referendums to actually try to get to a body of law that could be considered acceptable by the court, on which the people could vote. Okay, our case law is basically restricting the possibility to present a referendum if, in case of victory of the referendum, a legislative vacuum would result. I know that these are things that are unsexy and very technical, but this is the way it worked. So basically, we had to have this very technical, complicated work to be done, which we did in terms of constitutional law, but also we had to find a way to present water privatization or water corporatization, as you're telling it, as something really bad for the people, which was not easy to do at the time because the ideology out there was that the private was anyway more efficient than the public in running public services. Okay, so you'd go to the people and say, would you sign for a referendum? And you said, are you nuts? Why you want to oppose privatization and leave the water in the hands of these politicians that are corrupt, of this bureaucracy that works very badly? Actually, the private system would run water better than the public system. So there was a need of a big educational effort of the people in order to make people understand that between private and public, there is also the possibility of direct governance of resources, which is the commons. Okay, which is basically creating some sort of bodies that run public utilities in the public interest, in the interest of access, in the interest of the service, and not either in the interest of the private/corporate sector or in the interest of the government and the bureaucracy. That there was a space in between.
Ugo, who were your allies, and how did you get on the mass media in Italy to convey such a remarkable public opinion turnaround?
It was a remarkable thing. It's really kind of strange really, quite frankly, we had no access to public media at all. I mean, we had some, newspapers in which I personally was collaborating, like Il Manifesto or some others that would invite sporadic interventions. We had no TV appearance whatsoever in the national system until very, very late in the campaign. It was because then the law provides some guaranteed space. I don't think it was a media won victory. It was really sort of a grassroots. I personally did some, maybe more than 100 evenings around the country to discuss with small groups of people about it. Many other, 15, 20 other lawyers that were part before of the Rodotà Commission, so that we were involved in the same project, did the same. So we went around the country quite a bit. And in each one of those meetings, you'd meet 30, 40 people. And at the beginning, you'd kind of get the usual objections against the fact that people saying that privatization ultimately was good. So you had to go through the whole thing, and you spend, 2 hours, 3 hours with the people. And at the end of one of these meetings, there would be at least 3, 4, 5, 10 people that would be really on board. Because people understand how important it is not to leave water in corporate hands. Giving water to corporations is really putting ourselves literally and physically at the mercy of those monsters. And this is something that people don't realize, that once you run water for profit, you are better off if people is really thirsty. And you're better off if people consume a lot of water, which is counterintuitive on what we have to do now for water. We have shortages everywhere. We had actually to maintain it and to try to save water. We cannot afford to have golf courses in Los Angeles. That's too water consuming. And so all of that, the corporation that runs the water has an interest in selling water and has an interest in a lot of consumption of water. And so asking to a corporation to be ecological in terms of water is like asking someone to have to sell you shoes to advertise for people to go around barefoot. It's ridiculous. I mean, there is no sense in expecting that a private corporation that makes profit on water will tell to people consume little water. It's like expecting Adidas to tell to people go around barefoot. It's just absurd. So there is a big ideology around privatization and around the possibility of the private to run the public services, because the private will never run the public services in the interest of the ecology, of the general interest of the population, which is, maintaining the service, having access to it at reasonable prices, but, not wasting it. The waste is part of the deep structure of extractive capitalism.
Okay, I'm really interested for our listeners. This is amazing. You basically won this referendum without the help of the mass media.
Yes.
And you must have done it by picking up two allies, ordinary citizens who started word of mouth because you went all over Italy. And you must have had the aid of the municipalities, the towns and cities. How did you pull it off? And what was the final tally?
Well, first of all, I mean, I guess that in the picking up of signatures, we had an important alliance in the trade union. So there were, in particular, the CGIL, who was like the largest Italian trade union, which is still one of the few real massive organizations in Italy, came on board, and they helped us massively. There was an organization that was in place since 2005 that was called the Forum Italiano per i Movimenti dell'Acqua, Italian Forum for the Water Movements. That was part of the so-called No Global movement from Seattle to Genoa to Porto Alegre. That got together a bunch of activists that were around that helped very well and very strenuously. We were very lucky in finding a good logo because the commons, for some reason, became a very much of a buzzword in Italy in that period. Water as a commons. The campaign was called "See 2 yeses for water as a commons." I mean, it was something that arrived to the heart of the people quite a lot. I must tell you that water produced all sorts of different reactions. So if you go in the street and ask signatures for water back in 2009, 2010, people would come there, talk to you and line there because they were really worried about it. So there was some sensitivity. Now, the thing that is, so at the time, the outcome was we were, I must say, also a little lucky because the package of the referendum we produced, there were our referendums on water and then there was one on the nuclear that was introduced by the same kind of green alliance that we were pretty much putting together. And there was the Fukushima tragedy a few months before the vote, okay? Uh-huh. So people, because of that, there was a resurgence of the interest of the nukes in Italy. And a lot of people went to the poll, I think, honestly, because they were worried about what happened in Fukushima. So that helped us a lot.
What about the cities and towns?
Yeah. Cities and towns, we had some of them that were actually ready to fight because they thought that it was a good idea for them to keep the public services in their own hands. I must tell that the political parties were all against our referendum. The Democratic Party was against our referendum. The Berlusconi's party, Forza Italia, was against the referendum. But a lot of the voters, the interesting thing that a lot of the voters of the Democratic Party were actually against their leadership. So there was a separation between the leadership of the parties and the people, the social basis of the party itself. And at the end of the day, in the last month or so of the campaign, the Democratic Party switched. They understood that they had to help us out, at least they didn't oppose us anymore.
What was the final vote?
27 million people voted yes, so voted for abolishing the privatization statute, which means 95.6% of the vote were for us. And for the first time in Italy, and this was the first time always, a majority of the people of Italy, so the majority of the people of those that could vote, which was a pretty large number, was actually in favor of a referendum. So we have 95% of 95.6% or something of the national turnout, which was more than 51%, was almost 52% of the people that voted. So it was massive. It was a triumph. What happened after that is really interesting, that in spite of the fact that it was a triumph, the government tried to do business as usual. They just tried to say, that nothing really serious happened. And actually, that is what occurred, was a very interesting reaction by the because it was not just the government, it was really pretty much the European power. A month after the vote, that was July 2011, a very weird thing happened. There was a letter by the president of the European Central Bank, Trichet, at the time, together with Mario Draghi, who was to become the president after that sent a very unusual letter to Berlusconi, to the prime minister, telling him, we know that the people voted against privatizations, but privatizations are really key part of the program of Europe and are part of the conditions for Italy to stay within the parameters of European policy. Okay? So they basically said brutally, okay, you guys, we know that the Italian people don't want to privatize, but we in Brussels and Frankfurt believe that privatization is necessary, and therefore, please, Berlusconi, be sure not to do what your voters ask you to do. It was a very unusual move. You can go online and find this letter. Very scary.
Yeah, Ugo, right? This is part of the phenomenon, is why people from Britain to Italy are revolting against the European Union and the centralization of power and the rejection of what people want in the respective countries. But
yes,
you mentioned that the role of social media was starting to weaken your effort to rebound in this area.
Well, the social media at the time were practically not there. This is a very interesting perspective that I can give you, because that was not over. This whole story about corporatization in Italy is not over at all. We are still fighting. And right now, as we are talking, we are closing a campaign that we carried on for the last 6 months in order to reintroduce a statute in Parliament, okay, as a popular initiative that was the very same statute that that we protected with the referendum 10 years ago, but that was never enacted into law by Parliament, okay? So this is why I was telling the story. So what happened after the referendum was we got this intervention of the European powers. Berlusconi got scared. That was July 2011. Berlusconi got scared and hastily passed a law, unmaking the result of the referendum altogether, okay? Basically passed an emergency decree in August 15, was called the Decreto di Ferragosto. August 15, he passed a statute saying the result of the referendum is tanquam non esset. Things are going to go as before. Okay?
Amazing.
So he basically did what Draghi and Trichet told him to do. So what I had to do, that was August, me and others, but that one was really pretty much my own thing. I wrote an article on the Manifesto, which is the newspaper, asking a local government that was run by the left, the only one in Italy, to sue in government against this law. Okay, so I challenged that in front of the Constitutional Court. And we won that one. So the Constitutional Court said it's unconstitutional for a government to pass a law that unmakes the will of the people once the will of the people was expressly and formally expressed in a referendum. This was a turning point. That was a decision of the Constitutional Court. We gained that. Berlusconi got in crisis. 2011, the government of Berlusconi collapsed because Berlusconi was not able to deliver what they asked him to deliver from Brussels. This is the true story. All the rest, the girlfriends and all the other shit is just something that is part of the folklore. The truth of the matter is that Berlusconi was required to privatize these assets. We are talking about 250 billion euros. Okay? We're talking about real serious cash. Berlusconi was required to corporatize that. He couldn't deliver it because he was embattled. And so what happened was that the president at the time, Napolitano, put in a new government, which was the government of Mario Monti, was a European commissioner, basically telling him you're going to privatize anyway. So we had a complete constitutional crisis on that. A complete constitutional crisis.
By the way, our listeners should know that Berlusconi is a multi-billionaire.
He's a Trump.
Trump admires him.
Yeah, of course.
And he owns a lot of radio and TV stations. He's totally without any sense of boundaries or rule of law.
Yes.
And so that's who Ugo and his colleagues were taking on. Ugo, because of the time limitations, I want to have our readers learn about what you said could become an example for a global strategy. That means including the United States. And you have a very interesting way of getting people's attention. And you call it an experiment in transforming indignation, otherwise known as anger, into new institutions of the commons, where people will control what they own and not have it taken away by the corporate state or any other variation of corporate global domination. Could you explain that as briefly as you could, and how far it's getting and why it relates to people in our country?
Well, that's exactly what I was trying to say about the social media. So at the time, there were no social media yet very important. This time now, 10 years later, in which we are doing the same thing now to try to transform indignation in law, that is to say, to try to have finally, after 12 years, the reform of the civil code be put into the Italian books of law, okay? We've been collecting more signatures now, and we found it hard to get 50,000 signatures, okay? So we got 1.5 million to introduce the referendum. Now we find it difficult to find 50,000. We actually got it barely because the people today, after 10 years of neoliberalism and 10 years of social media, are not able anymore to understand physical struggles.
This is an amazing comment.
This is really important. The social media are against social movements. It's complete rhetoric and narrative that the internet and the social media are crucial for the success of these kind of battles. It's
supposed to be just the opposite, right?
It's supposed to be the opposite, but it's not true. That's what the people believe, but it's not true. It's simply plainly false. The social media are not avenues of emancipation, of political emancipation of the people. Actually, are ways to keep the people attached to their laptops, hypnotized by their cell phones, believing they're doing politics by writing "I like it" on some Facebook program, giving away their personal data, creating a society of control and a society of surveillance and of spectacle that is the opposite of what we try to create when we talk we need institutions of the commons. Institutions of the commons are institutions that require physical participation, that require engagement, that require discussion, thorough discussion, not slogans. We have to invent institutions, new institutions that are going to be in place for the next 100 years, that are able to substitute institutional constructions that took 200 years to capital to build and to destroy with its own corporatization. Okay? So we are talking about really important work we have to do, and we cannot do that on Twitter. Okay?
Ugo, obviously, it's music to my ears. We've been trying to say this to people, but you actually saw it on the ground. When you had to go physically and meet and connect with people, you collected far more signatures and aftermath energy by far than when you had access to theoretically all the people on the social media. So you're saying you cannot really build democracy and fight the power structure by virtual reality. You have to do it with on the ground with real people. I got to get David and Steve's comments on this. Why don't you pitch in? What do you think about that?
I'm kind of curious about this actually having happened in Bolivia. Didn't the World Bank force Bolivia to privatize some of its public water? And what happened? Didn't Bechtel get the contract? The people stood up.
Well,
It became illegal to
That's
collect rainwater at one point?
Yeah, well, that's really what inspired Italy. The struggle in Cochabamba. That was a victory, but that was a victory that costed 16. People died on that. There was 40 days of strike for people against the privatization of water. People died on the streets against the cops.
This is in Bolivia.
2001, Bolivia, Cochabamba, corporatization of the water system, transfer from the government of the city to Bechtel Corporation here in California, okay? So Bechtel Corporation starts running the water and privatizes it, and the price goes up to the point of going almost 40% of the income of the median Bolivian person. That's outrageous, okay? So people took the streets because they were starving, and they fought for 40 days, and they won, and the boy was killed, and other people were wounded. And eventually, Bechtel had to left the contract. The water was given in the hands of the people, and Evo Morales took power in Bolivia against this, crony presidents of the World Bank. That's what happened in Bolivia. And that's what in Italy, it happened in a different way. Luckily, it was less dramatic, but we had the inspiration from there. In both these occasions, the social media had no role whatsoever. Okay? Today, people are not patient anymore. I was in the street again. I did about 70 evenings in the last 6 months, in Italy, everywhere, to talk about these things, and about the importance of introducing the commons in the civil code, and how the water and all the commons institutions are going to be protected if the legal system gets in tune again with community, with nature. We have to do a lot of very structural transformations to give some hope to the future, okay? And people had no patience. If you see 3 people in front of you to sign, because you sign in front of a notary, it takes a few minutes, okay? If there are 3 people in front of you to sign, people would run away. They would say, "Oh, you have no time. I will go online. I will participate. I will get done online." I said, "You cannot do it online." But people is so used now that everything happens in the exact moment in which they need it. They have no patience for a relationship. There is no patience for putting something on the stake other than your last 20, 30 minutes of your day, conveniently sitting in your sofa, believing you're doing politics because you are saying, "I like you," to Greta Thunberg. Okay?
Do we have this is the way in which
politics became.
We have de facto water privatization in Newark, in Flint, and the San Joaquin Valley in California. The almond growers are taking all the water, and the taps are empty. Don't we have de facto water privatization?
Well, there is the things that are de facto is that are de jure. And that's very different because, it is true that the farmers in California or in places like that are getting the lion's share. But it's also true that the fact of maintaining water as a public utility and maintaining it under some sort of form of serious government control in the United States pretty much happens. There are examples. Yeah, Flint was the opposite example. But, by and large, there is no narrative of saying it would be a good thing to give all the water of the United States to Coca-Cola or Nestlé. Okay? It might be de facto, but the jure and politically is not something that people would stand for. In Italy, there has been majority of people before the water referendum, politicians, policymakers, they would say it would be a good thing to give to Veolia running the water system in Italy. Okay? Veolia is a French multinational corporation that has done all sorts of disastrous things with water worldwide. Okay? So people were actually saying that it was a good idea to go to corporatization. The point is, it's not a good idea. The point is that we have to work out institutions that transform this de facto privatization you're talking about in a running the water like a common. I was myself the president of the water company in Naples. We experimented for 2 years after the referendum, the attempt to give back the water to the people. And we did some very interesting experiments in, constructing participatory bodies of people to check in the running of the water, ecological governance of water systems. So we experimented a lot of things, but we were embattled because these global corporations corrupt governments, and governments actually want to have people disengage and managers run the water as you run every other commodity. Okay? And this is what we've been trying to stop in the last 15 years of my life. And we have to keep doing that, but it's becoming more and more difficult exactly when it should become easier. Okay,
let's get to your reform proposal, which is transforming, quote, indignation into new institutions of the commons, end quote.
Yes.
Can you summarize that briefly for us and why you think this would be an example for other countries, including ours?
Well, because, the private or corporate running of public interest is becoming lethal practically everywhere. The very distinction between the private and the public, is a distinction that is there to shield plunder and other lethal behaviors, both of the private governments and of the corporation. I mean, the military-industrial complex is basically what is still going on. Now, the commons find it difficult to organize themselves as institutions because of this sort of mental box in which we operate. Okay? So what we mean by institutions of the commons is, for example, cooperatives of workers and users running the water system. In Naples, what we tried to do was to transform the water company into a sort of co-op of workers of the water system and users of the water system that together work in order to run the water with a mandate of running it ecologically.
Did it work?
So you need new institutions for doing that. You cannot do that with old institutions. You cannot run the private transportation, the public transportation in a large city like New York, outsourcing it to some sort of smart governance of some private corporation that does it for profit. You need to get the stakeholders around the table, and these stakeholders have to work with good lawyers to arrange systems that are actually a guarantee of the rights of future generation to the service, a guarantees of the ecological compatibility of the service, a guarantee of the accessibility. All these kind of things have to be factored in institutional settings that are new corporate forms. New corporate forms we need, okay? This is why I believe this is extremely relevant and why I'm struggling to do it in Italy. Because if in Italy we introduce, for example, and we will be talking about Greta in the next few minutes, but if in Italy we introduce the rights of future generations, okay, within the definition of the commons and within the definition of property law, and we give to judges, to adjudicators, the possibility to decide a case not in the interest either of the plaintiff or of the defendant, but in the interest of future generation, okay? This is going to be a major transformation in an advanced industrial democracy. Okay, which is already observed with a lot of interest in other European legal systems, might contaminate other European legal systems, and might from the bottom up introduce institutional obligations to judges, to administrators, to take into consideration the rights of future generation in their everyday adjudication. We have to change the default rules of the game. It is not by some ecological statute that introduce some new standards that we are changing things. We are changing things if we change the default rules of the system. That is to say, right now, in modernity, we operate with a legal system that has as a fundamental idea the increase of capital. We have to introduce a legal system that has at its core idea the regeneration of the commons, the reconstruction of both institutions and of practices that allow us to take good care of the common resources, both those that are in private hands and those that are in public hands, and we put an obligation to run that for the interest of future generation, right in the fundamental rules of the game, in how any adjudication works. I sue my neighbor on a gutter, Okay? Right now, the judge has to decide either for me, plaintiff, or for my neighbor, defendant. I want judges that decide for the interest of water. Okay? I want judges that decide in the interest of those that will have to enjoy similar conditions to mine today, 30 years from now. If we don't do that, which are, is the fundamental roots of the game, those the signals that the society kind of uses to decide our directions. It's like a flock of birds. Okay, a flock of birds, there is no head of the flock of birds, but the birds know where to fly. You see, humankind, the way in which we signal to each other things is through private law, is to the basic foundations of the ordinary legal system that we obey without even knowing we obey it. Okay? So those incentive schemes, today, those incentive schemes are completely pro-competition, pro-short-termism, pro-being flexible, pro all sorts of keywords, from being smart, from all the sort of keywords that are in the interest of capital. Now we have to introduce legal system that contains basic fundamental rules of default that are transforming, that will transform all this capital we have into good, healthy commons. Okay? Nothing less than that. And this is the collective enterprise that requires construction of institutions. And this is the example we are trying to do in Italy now by constructing this, what we call a dolphin institution, that is to say a large corporation that has in its DNA not extraction and short term, but has in its DNA transformation of capital into commons. That's the challenge to me of the sources of law of the future, to understand that the sources of law has to be back in the hands of the people and have to be, engineered from their basic substance to give correct incentives that take into consideration the right of the environment, the right of the socially weak people, and the rights of future generation. All of that right now is not in the legal system.
We've been talking to Ugo Mattei. Ugo, we're out of time. How do people get more information to reflect on this? Because this is quite unique, what you're doing. You're building it on a huge amount of wealth that's already owned as a commons by the people, but they've lost control of it.
Yes.
And I include trillions of dollars of government research and development that built Silicon Valley and built a good deal of the aerospace, drug industry, biotech, nanotech, and people got nothing for that.
Yes.
But that's the kind of commons that research and development funded by the taxpayer. Before we close, and we're really out of time, unfortunately, how can people get more information? Do you have a website?
Well, reading the paperback edition that is coming out of the Turning Point in Private Law is actually very updated and is the manifesto of our current campaign. And so it is like, actually the Italian version is even used to finance the actual campaign. So that is a good read to reflect in a more scholarly way. And then, if you just go online and, the thing of the water referendum, there are publications in English. If you Google my name, you'll find all sorts of ways to get to these informations you might be interested in. We have a website, but unluckily right now is in Italian. So we are in the middle of organizing, but I would start. I'm sorry, it looks like a self-promotion, but it is not really. Maybe reading the Turning Point in Private Law would be a good start.
Yes, and it's just for people to go into the internet. It's Ugo Mattei. That's UGO, last name Mattei, professor of law, and one of the most creative legal thinkers and doers in the country of Italy and around the world. Thank you very much, Ugo.
Ralph, thank you so much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
We've been speaking with Professor Ugo Mattei. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. We're going to take a short break, but before we do that, we're going to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, September 27, 2019. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Le Laboratoire Servier is standing trial in Paris, charged with offenses, including corporate manslaughter following as many as 2,000 deaths, allegedly linked to the sale of its mediator drug. That's according to a report from Bloomberg News. Paris judges have carved out more than half a year of courtroom time to scrutinize the scandal over the diabetes treatment that was widely used as an appetite suppressant and sold in France for 33 years. A government medicine safety agency, as well as 14 suspects, are also on trial on accusations ranging from aggravated deceit to manslaughter. Servier said it acknowledges and regrets that patients suffered because of taking Mediator and has been focusing on compensating victims. A lawyer for the company said the drug maker wants to explain why it hadn't identified any risks before 2009. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Okay, let's knock out a couple of listener questions. David, why don't you do the honors?
Comes to us from Jay Goldberg. He says, I revere Ralph, but he needs to stop obsessing about anonymous comments on the internet and speak out against the real problem, which is that Congress is restricting free speech online. What difference should it make if I submitted this comment as Cardinal Richelieu or Smokey the Bear? Listeners should be free to judge it on its merits.
It's not either or, Jay. You're right that the government is allowing Facebook to censor more and more news and opinion, and that's a separate problem and a serious one. But obviously, I'm going to guess now, I don't think you have been subjected to relentless mass slander the way many teenagers are and many controversial people in the public sphere. You tend to be less self-censoring yourself when you have to put your name on your opinion. That's why they require names on letters to the editor. Would you want anonymous letters to the editor in the print version? And for people who have a legitimate need, we discussed that with Professor Robert Felmuth. So it isn't a total absolute ban on anonymous speech. Thank you.
I also think it's Smokey Bear, not
Smokey the Bear?
I think it's Smokey Bear, not Smokey the Bear.
That's an important addition to that question. Thank you, David. Our next question comes from John Bailey. He says, hey, guys, a weekly must-listen and re-listen show. He says, I keep thinking we need a law I would call, quote-unquote, statistical murder. This would be engaging in an activity with a measurable probability of causing death, affecting a large enough number of people so deaths become certainty. And it seems to me, he says, the opioid companies would be guilty. And you could add many others. What do you think about this statistical murder or measurable probability of causing death, Ralph?
Well, I think you're making an important point. Someone can say that's already the doctrine of criminal negligence, criminal corporate negligence. That is, the opiate manufacturers were pushing and deceiving and not putting accurate truth behind the merchandising of these powerful opiates to make money, and that they knew, especially after the passage of some months or years, that people were dying. So at the least, that is criminal negligence, and the companies and executives can be criminally prosecuted, as some are beginning to be. So they don't call it statistical murder or homicide. It's criminal negligence. And if they can show willfulness, then it's more than criminal negligence. It is homicide.
Very good. Thank you for that question. Next.
This comes to us from Paul Koulas. Howdy, Ralph. My mother cared about politics and what was happening in the world. She told me I should do the same. From when I started in tech in 1989 till circa 2006, I wasn't doing what she told me. Then I saw how right she was. So I put solar on our house, donated to progressive causes, started a blog, went to marches and protests, planted wildflowers, stopped using pesticides, started composting, went vegan, read books, blogs, and articles, watched documentaries and movies, attended events, bought a Tesla, and talked to lots of people and more. Yet here we are, the planet is melting, Trump is president. I was at the climate strike protest in Denver this past week. What I saw were a few thousand people demanding culture change. But what I didn't see were a few thousand people focused on voting.
Well, welcome. And
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned in your email my book, Breaking Through Power, It's Easier Than You Think, where I try to answer your question. And I show actual examples where a very few people built enough popular base so they got laws through, like water pollution laws, like motor vehicle safety laws and pension rights laws and so on. And it's just a little book, and it also has the summons to the members of Congress. So if you're talking about not just protests, not just demands, but actual enactment of law that becomes enforceable, go to the book, Breaking Through Power. It's easier than you think. And if you really want to zero in laser-like on 535 members of Congress, senators and representatives, the fable, How the Rats Reformed Congress, is right up your alley. It may be a fable, but it gets to be a tremendously motivated and detailed way where people can build Congress watchdog groups in their congressional district and reverberate it by demanding through the summons of their Senate representatives to town meetings back home, face-to-face, no virtual reality, and you instruct them when they return to Congress to reflect the will of the people on specific issues that you are well informed on. And you don't need more than a couple thousand in each congressional district, which has 700,000 people, to get that done when you have a majority opinion behind you. So go to ratsreformcongress.org and get a copy. People are ordering 5 copies, I hope, for discussion and action, 5 copies at a time. It's written to motivate, even though it's a fable.
I want to thank our guests again, Ugo Mattei. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And you heard him talk about this one book, The Fable, How the Rats Reformed Congress, on the show today. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And, of course, there's another one, To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. We will link to that also.
Producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak with constitutional scholar John Boniface about impeachment. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, listeners. Spread the word. Get more radio stations to carry the program if you're enjoying it week to week.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up. Now, Steve and Ralph go through some of your guest suggestions.
So, Ralph, we've got some questions, but we also get a lot of suggestions for guests and topics on the show, and we're going to discuss a few of those right now. Just talk about the first one is from a John Weiss, who says, I'm founder and publisher of the Colorado Springs Independent, the alt weekly serving the Pikes Peak region. In the 70s and 80s, he ran Fair Test, the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, a group you know, Ralph, he says. He says, Kroger, America's largest grocery store chain, has decided to kick all free newspapers out of their stores, and they're launching back with dozens of other papers a campaign to get them to change their mind. The campaign is called Don't Lose Local News, all one word. And he wants to know, is there any way we can get on the show?
Well, I can suggest how you can turn Kroger around. The one thing they can't stand is picketing peacefully in front of their stores because it inhibits customers from going in and slows the process down. So you basically say, you either put our newspapers the way you used to, so people have access to them and the way other supermarket chains do, or you're going to have some of the readers of these newspapers parade back and forth in front of your front doors.
Okay, very good. Thanks for that suggestion, John. The next one comes from Jerry Odom, and the subject is voting machines. He says, hi, Mr. Nate, I would love for you to cover on the podcast the extremely dangerous consequences of using computer-based voting systems in our elections. And he suggests a potential guest, and he wrote an open letter. And he says voting systems aren't something most people tend to worry about, as evidence in the recent documentary, I Voted. But people need to pay attention before Mark Twain is proven right when he said, quote, if voting made any difference, they wouldn't let us do it. He says, thank you again for all your amazing work and your precious time, Jerry Odom.
Jerry, my view is there shouldn't be any computerized voting systems. They're too easily hacked. The software is proprietary and owned by companies. In one case, the head of the company was an advocate of George W. Bush. And there's too much mischief on voting day from whoever can hack these anywhere in the world. It's very hard to track them. So I favor the Canadian system. It's entirely a paper ballot. They have a lot of precincts, no more than 500 potential voters per precinct, so they can add them up quickly. By 11 p.m. at night on voting day, they know who's been elected from the Northwest Territories to New Brunswick. I don't know why we keep not learning from our neighbor to the north the most common sense way. And it'll save billions of dollars because the voting machine industry, which tends to give campaign contributions, gets a lot of these machines sold that you pay for as a taxpayer. Now, the moderate reform is to make sure all these voting machines have a paper trail so you can have recounts and they don't get lost. There's still several states that don't even have a paper trail. And, with the Electoral College, one state can flip an election, put someone like Trump in or someone like George W. Bush in the winner-take-all system without proportional representation. So thanks for bringing this to the attention. We had a guest on recently, Harvey Wasserman from Ohio, who is convinced that the Ohio ballots were tampered with in 2004, which denied the election to John Kerry in favor of George W. Bush.
And I think in the recent Israeli elections, they were all paper ballots too, which seems very sensible.
Correct.
Okay, this next suggestion comes from Jim Byron. He says, "Hi, Ralph. I highly recommend inviting Jeffrey Pfeffer, he's a Stanford Business School professor and researcher, to join you to discuss the results of his book and research called Dying for a Paycheck. Among other tremendous insights his research provides, he documents that the workplace is the fifth leading cause of death due to its management practices. While the physical safety parts of jobs have improved as part of OSHA and regulations, there is a growing and deadly wellness impact being brought on by poor corporate management practice. It would be great to hear a conversation between the two of you. Thanks for considering this idea, Jim Byron."
Jim Byron, more than consider it a done deal. We're going to be calling Professor Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford Business School very shortly. There aren't many people now writing books on why over 60,000 workers from disease or trauma die every year from workplace-related conditions. And of course, that doesn't even include the trauma of survivors and the respiratory ailments and cancer of other workers who managed to survive. It's almost never discussed, even by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, not to mention the others in election campaigns. I discussed it in all my campaigns. These are the real forgotten workers. Thank you for that suggestion. Consider it, implement it.
This next suggestion comes from Robert Bergdahl. The subject is big food and chronic disease. He writes, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, 75% chronic disease in the U.S. is caused by processed food consumption. You need to interview Dr. Robert Lustig and fellow medical researchers at the University of California, San Francisco.
Good point, Robert. We need to do more on this. In the last 40 or 50 years, the processed food industry, the agribusiness industry, the fast food industry have been on a rampage of basically making food tasty, colorful, sexy, that's killing people. And the connection between high fat, high salt, high sugar, and mortality and morbidity is overwhelming in the scientific literature. And so we need to focus not just on what people are eating and how they should be eating better food like a Mediterranean diet. It's also delicious, but how these companies are reaching youngsters at 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds with junk sugar drink and fat and salty food. And that has to be focused very much, just like people are now focusing attention on the opiate manufacturers, not just the distributors and the sellers at the street level. Thank you for that. We'll be on top of that shortly.
Well, thank you for your suggestions. Keep them coming on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we welcome constitutional law expert John Boniface about the I word, impeachment.
Stand up, you've been sitting